As a veteran cop, I thought I'd seen it all. 2 decades on the force had hardened me to death, violence, and despair. But the case that came to be known as the Chimera case, that one changed everything. It was late, and the hum of the heater in my cruiser was almost hypnotic. My thoughts drifted to the stack of paperwork I'd left on my desk, the kind that never seemed to get smaller no matter how much I chipped away at it. That's when the radio crackled to life, the static sharp and urgent. Emergency assistance needed at Grand Avenue Park. Female victim. Severe injuries. Critical condition. I grabbed the mic, my instincts kicking in immediately. Copy that. En route. Any additional details? Negative, came the reply, the voice cutting in and out through the interference. Scene unclear. I turned the key, my engine roaring to life as I pulled onto the darkened street. The park wasn't far, and the roads were quiet this time of night. Streetlights cast long shadows over empty sidewalks, and a light fog clung to the ground, making the city feel eerily still. By the time I arrived, the quiet had given way to chaos. Emergency vehicles crowded the entrance to the park, their lights painting the trees in pulsating red and blue. A crowd of onlookers had gathered just beyond the tape, their murmurs filling the air with unease. I flashed my badge and ducked under the cordon, heading toward the cluster of uniforms near the center of the commotion. As I approached, one of the younger officers glanced back and stepped aside, giving me a clear view of the scene. I stopped cold. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. It was a woman, or at least, it had been. Her body was covered in what looked like thousands of tiny, jagged toothpicks, each embedded so deeply into her skin that they seemed fused to her flesh. Blood seeped from every puncture wound, soaking her clothes and pooling beneath her. The sheer number of them was overwhelming. They jutted out at odd angles, bristling like some horrific coat of fur. And she was still alive. Her breath came in shallow, shuddering gasps, each one causing the toothpicks to shift slightly, tearing her skin further. Her face, miraculously untouched, was pale and damp with sweat, her lips trembling with each ragged inhale. But it was her eyes that held me. Wide, unfocused, filled with a pain so profound it made my chest tighten. A paramedic knelt beside her, his gloved hands hovering over her as if afraid to touch her. He looked up at me, his face pale and tight. "We can't move her," he said, his voice low. "Every time we try, the toothpicks dig deeper. It's like they're anchored. Can't you remove them?" I asked, though the words felt ridiculous even as I said them. He shook his head. "They're barbed. Pulling them out would rip her apart from the inside. We tried a breathing tube, but," he gestured helplessly toward her face. Her throat and nose were just as impaled as the rest of her. I crouched down beside him, my boots squelching in the blood-soaked ground. Forcing myself to look at her was harder than I expected. Her chest rose and fell in defiance of the inevitable, but it was clear she didn't have long. "Who found her?" I asked, my voice rough. "A jogger," he replied. "Called it in about 20 minutes ago. Said she was like this when they arrived. No sign of anyone else." Anything else unusual? He hesitated, then nodded toward another officer. We found some items near her. The officer approached, handing me an evidence bag. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a silver wristwatch. I took the bag, my focus immediately drawn to the watch. There was something about it, its size, its shape, that tugged at the edges of my memory. I pulled it out and turned it over, my heart pounding as I read the engraving on the back. A.K. 2 simple letters. The world seemed to tilt as the realization hit me. Those weren't just initials. They were hers, Amelia Kane. My sister. She'd been missing for 3 years. One night, she went out for a run and never came back. We searched for months, following every lead, but it was like she'd vanished into thin air. Eventually, the case went cold, and I was forced to move on. Or at least pretend to. But now here she was. I forced myself to look at her again. Past the toothpicks, past the blood. Her face, God, her face, was still hers. Older, gaunt, hollowed by whatever nightmare she'd endured, but unmistakable. And her eyes, they weren't just in pain. They were begging. I stumbled back a step, my pulse roaring in my ears. This wasn't just a crime. It wasn't something I could explain with reason or logic. This was something else. Something impossible. And then, it hit me. The world seemed to slow to a crawl. My breath caught, my chest tightening as I stared at her. Those eyes, no matter how hollow or pain-filled, were hers. My sister's. Amelia. The weight of it nearly knocked me over. For 3 years, I'd lived with the belief that she was dead, gone without a trace, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a grieving family. Now, she was here, dying all over again in front of me, and I hadn't even recognized her until it was too late. The realization was unbearable. I turned away, unable to look at her broken body any longer. The grief clawed at me, suffocating, relentless. If I didn't leave, I'd collapse right there, in front of my colleagues, in front of the shell of the woman I used to know. I gave a brief nod to the officer standing by the barricade, ducked under the tape, and walked away as quickly as my legs would carry me. I barely noticed the murmurs of the paramedics or the way the blood seemed to cling to my boots like a curse. As I reached the edge of the park, something in my hand caught my attention. A small slip of paper. I didn't even remember taking it. Maybe one of the paramedics had handed it to me while I was too consumed by shock to notice. I unfolded it carefully, my fingers trembling. Do you think about my little hedgehog? If you like it, don't worry. My zoo has only just begun. My stomach twisted. The words felt like a taunt, each one heavier than the last. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the madness. I'd worked in law enforcement long enough to know the depths of human cruelty. I'd seen things that could break a person's soul, families destroyed by betrayal, lives snuffed out in an instant. But this was something else. Something darker. As I read the note again, memories clawed their way to the surface, the countless cases of senseless violence that had shaped my career. The cheating husband whose wife had snapped, stabbing him in their kitchen before ending her own life. The young woman was shoved onto train tracks by a stalker who'd been watching her for months. And now, my sister, tortured and mutilated in a way I couldn't even begin to comprehend. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a symbol. The monster who committed this vile act against my sister had given her a name, the Hedgehog. The nickname only made it worse. It was cruel, mocking. And it wasn't just a name, it was a signature, a promise that this wasn't over. I clenched the note tightly, my mind racing. Whoever this was, they had planned every detail, right down to leaving my sister in that park for me to find. They wanted me involved. The logistics of it haunted me. How had they done it? The toothpicks were barbed and embedded so deeply that even moving her risked tearing her apart. Medical staff said it was impossible to remove them without causing catastrophic damage. That left one horrifying conclusion: those toothpicks had been inserted slowly, methodically, over months, maybe even years. The thought made my skin crawl. But the biggest question remained: why? Why my sister? Why go through all this effort to torment her like this? Revenge? Random selection? Or something else entirely? I had no answers. What made it worse was the cruel timing of it all. After years of believing she was gone, mourning her, imagining a quick death, she had been alive, suffering in ways I couldn't begin to fathom. And now, she was gone for good, leaving behind a wound that would never heal. But the note, it changed everything. This wasn't just about Amelia. The message was clear: this was only the beginning, that psycho wasn't done. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my desk, the evidence scattered around me like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve. The silver watch, once my sister's, now sat tightly around my wrist. Its weight was a reminder of what I'd lost, and what I had to do. The next morning, a package arrived at my office. My birthday wasn't for another month, but the envelope was addressed to me, and the contents made my blood run cold. Inside was a card, handwritten in a neat, almost elegant script. "Happy birthday, detective." Below the message was an address scrawled hastily. I didn't recognize it, but forensics would later confirm that the handwriting matched the note found at the scene. The implications sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't random. The killer knew me, knew my connection to Amelia, knew I was the one who would find her. How long had they been watching? Had they been at the park that night, hiding in the shadows while we swarmed the scene? I clenched my fists, my mind spinning. This was personal now. Whoever this was, they'd made a mistake. They'd left me breadcrumbs, and I was going to follow them. Not just for Amelia. Not just for justice. For revenge. That evening, I went to 12 Baker Street with three of the best men I knew: Carter, a burly man who could keep his cool in any situation; Diaz, who was not as physically impressive as Carter, but whose intelligence made up for it. His quick thinking had saved many a cop's life. And Oliver, an analyst, whether in the field or in the office, always had a handle on the details. I had picked the best to take on the worst. Baker Street was a row of warehouses in an industrial area on the outskirts of town. All the warehouses looked identical, large, rectangular, and built of red brick. About half of them were still in operation, producing various materials for shipment around the world, while the other half looked abandoned. 12, Baker Street was one of them. It had a typical, unassuming appearance: broken glass, trash piled all around, a few broken bricks on the outside, and a door slightly off its hinges. I gritted my teeth and signaled to the others, then slowly walked through the open front door. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the darkness inside, as I was against using a flashlight at the time. I could hear the unmistakable dripping sound of water falling from the ceiling into a nearby hollow. The air seemed thick and musty, mostly it smelled of wet cardboard and something vaguely metallic. The stench was a sharp, pungent smell that overwhelmed all the other smells. I continued forward, my team followed closely behind. Oliver gave me a raised eyebrow, and I nodded in return. "This is the place," I told him silently. "Be ready for anything." We passed through another set of doors and entered a room dimly lit by a single ceiling light. In the middle of the room, under the light, was a person. To say a person would be an exaggeration. Normally, a human neck is 10 to 15 centimeters long, measured from shoulder to chin. The man in front of me had a neck 10 times that long. He was kneeling, his neck grew from his shoulder like a vine, then curled down. The neck continued to crawl across the floor for another 1.5 meters, ending in a head. He saw us and began to slowly shuffle toward us, dragging his head and that strangely long neck. He groaned in pain as he moved, and I could see blood trickling from the stitches that were spaced a few centimeters apart along his neck. As he got closer, blood fell to the floor, leaving a bright red trail with each step. He groaned again, looking up at us, clearly in excruciating pain. "What the hell is this?" Diaz cried out behind me. I kept my eyes on the man. "I don't know," I replied. "Another animal-themed mutant." It seemed so. I stood still, watching, unsure of what to do as he dragged his long neck and body toward us. He looked me straight in the eye, his mouth opening as if to speak, but only a horrible groan came out. I understood what he meant, though. His mouth was open in a circle, seemingly emphasizing a single syllable: help. I backed away, mostly out of fear. I knew the creature probably wouldn't do anything to me, but in the back of my mind, alarm bells were ringing. This wasn't natural. Humans weren't supposed to look like this. I needed to leave now. I could feel my team behind me tense up and back away, probably going through the same thing. The man continued to crawl forward, leaving a trail of blood behind him. His movements were becoming slower and weaker, life seemed to be slipping away from him. It was clear that I was witnessing the final moments of a man being tortured to death. A voice spoke again. It came from above, broken and distorted, probably over the speaker system. It sounded calm, even cheerful, as if everything that was happening was normal. "Welcome, everyone, to the newest attraction at the human zoo, a beautiful giraffe, created by slowly tearing off parts of his neck, then replacing them with larger, more suitable pieces of human flesh. I grimaced. It didn't sound pleasant. A slow process, yes. But look at the end result. Isn't it wonderful? Much more beautiful than the original, right, Ethan? I looked up, almost reflexively. It was my name. Anyway, I just wanted to say thank you for volunteering such a wonderful specimen to add to my collection. I know you'll enjoy the wonderful things I've prepared for you. The voice stopped. And at that moment, I became aware of two things. The deafening sound of metal on metal came from the right, across the room, a gunshot. And to the left, Carter's leg jerked back, sending him sprawling. Blood spurted from the area just above his knee, a bullet wound. I did what anyone facing an unseen gunman in an enclosed space would do. I dove for cover. My pulse was hammering as I skidded behind a stack of old, dusty crates, crouching low to stay out of sight. Adrenaline made my movements clumsy, but fear kept me sharp. Oliver was beside me, his face pale and eyes wide. Diaz was nowhere to be seen. Carter lay sprawled on the cold concrete, blood pooling around his leg. The sniper was still out there, somewhere, and we were sitting ducks. Then the lights went out. Total darkness swallowed the room, and with it came the kind of panic that claws at your throat. My ears strained, trying to filter every sound. I heard soft footsteps near where Carter had fallen, too quiet to identify. Was it Diaz, trying to help? Or was it the sniper, closing in for the kill? Then I heard another set of footsteps, heavier, deliberate. And more than one pair. My chest tightened as I realized we weren't dealing with just one attacker. I weighed my options. Running to Carter was tempting, but he was too heavy to carry alone. I glanced at Oliver, his breath quick and shallow, waiting for some kind of direction. Before I could speak, the lights snapped back on, harsh and unforgiving. The scene before me froze the breath in my lungs. The giraffe lay crumpled and still, his grotesque neck twisted unnaturally, blood pooling beneath him. Diaz was slumped over a crate in the distance, battered and barely conscious, his face swollen and streaked with blood. But Carter was gone. The sniper was gone too, leaving nothing but silence and the metallic tang of blood in the air. Oliver and I dragged Diaz back to the car. He was alive, but just barely. Whatever fight he'd been in had left him bruised and broken, but not beaten. I wish I could say the same for the giraffe. A quick sweep of the warehouse turned up nothing. It was like the attackers had vanished, leaving no trace. No spent shells, no footprints, nothing. The place looked untouched, almost staged. But the words from the speaker system kept replaying in my head, larger pieces of flesh. That neck wasn't made from just one person. It was made from many. And if they'd done this to one man, how many others were out there? The fallout from the incident hit fast and hard. The next morning, I was summoned to Sergeant Grace's office. Grace, a tough-as-nails woman with a permanent scowl etched into her face, didn't bother with pleasantries. She sat behind her desk, flipping through a file, her expression as sharp as a blade. "What the hell happened, Ethan?" she asked, looking up at me with piercing eyes. "We weren't prepared," I said bluntly. Clearly, she shot back. One man missing, another in critical condition. That's not unprepared, that's reckless. Did you even take proper precautions? With respect, ma'am, you weren't there, I snapped, my voice rising despite myself. Nothing could have prepared us for what we saw. Nothing. You think anyone could walk into that nightmare and just keep their cool? Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking under the weight of the conversation. The higher-ups want you on leave. Leave? I echoed, stunned. After everything that happened, you're benching me? It's not a punishment, she said, holding up a hand. It's damage control. The media's already sniffing around, and they don't need more fuel. Take the time off, Ethan. That's an order. She extended her hand expectantly, and I knew what she wanted. Slowly, I unhooked my badge and gun, placing them on her desk. It'll blow over, she said, her voice softening. Take care of yourself. I didn't reply. I just walked out, feeling like the weight of the world had been dropped on my chest. I went home and crashed, exhaustion taking over. When I woke, the clock read 4 p.m. I barely had time to process my grogginess before the doorbell rang. It rang again, insistent and grating. Dragging myself out of bed, I shuffled to the door, irritation growing with each step. When I opened it, a skinny teenager stood there, grinning sheepishly. He looked no older than 18, with shaggy hair and nervous energy that made him bounce on the balls of his feet. What do you want? I asked, my voice rough from sleep. Yeah, he said, scratching the back of his neck. I was hired to drive you somewhere. I mean, if you want to go. I frowned, trying to make sense of his words. What are you talking about? He shrugged. Don't know much. Someone paid me $500 to come here and see if you'd come with me. They said it's your choice, no pressure. Before I could respond, he held out a folded piece of paper. Oh, right. They told me to give you this. I took the note and unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, almost playful. I heard you're out of work. Come work at my zoo. We're always looking for new keepers. The kid peered at me curiously.
So, you coming?
I stood there, staring at the kid in disbelief. My mind raced. How could anyone know I had just lost my job? This had only happened hours ago. It felt like a setup, a trap. This kid could very well be an accomplice or worse. The last time I followed a cryptic note like this, I ended up losing one person and nearly lost another. But I was here now. The choice seemed to be made for me. What else could I do? I had nothing left to lose. Fine, I said, my voice hoarse. I'll go. He smiled and drove with the caution of someone who had just passed his driver's test. We left the city behind, the skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror, as we headed further out into the desolate countryside. The silence grew heavier, the kind that made your ears ring. After 30 minutes of winding through narrow, empty roads, he finally stopped at the entrance to a sprawling farm. I glanced at the sign as we passed it, Winston Family Farm. The road split and the kid turned right, taking us up to a large country house. Lights flickered on inside, casting a soft glow through the windows, and the distant hum of machinery buzzed from the barn. He parked the car and turned to me with a grin. "This is your stop. Have a great evening, sir," he said as if he'd just dropped me off at a friend's house for dinner. I watched him drive off, his headlights fading into the distance. The quiet of the night enveloped me as I walked up the steps to the house, unsure of what waited inside. I could hear voices, a mixture of talking and laughing, coming from within. It sounded just like any typical dinner gathering. I knocked hesitantly, the weight of my doubt almost keeping me from following through. The muffled voices inside stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. A moment later, light footsteps approached, and the door creaked open to reveal a man who seemed eerily familiar, medium height, short-cropped hair, and a scraggly beard. His eyes, though, they were distant, unfocused, like they weren't really looking at me but through me. Then he smiled, warm and inviting, like we were old friends meeting by chance. "Glad you came," he said, his voice light and casual, as though the tension clinging to me didn't exist. "Dinner's ready. Come in and eat with us." That voice, that face, it triggered something deep in my mind, and the memories slammed into me like a freight train. The night I found my sister's body. The paramedic standing by her lifeless form, handing me a note I couldn't stop thinking about. His eyes were just as they were now, somewhere else, detached, like he wasn't even there. I know you," I said, my voice sharpening. He raised an eyebrow, his smile never faltering. "Oh. That's good. Makes making friends a little easier, doesn't it? Come on in. You look like you could use a meal." I didn't move. The anger flared inside me, sudden and overwhelming, choking me with its intensity. "Stop talking bullshit," I shouted, my voice raw and trembling. You killed my sister." The smile slipped from his face, replaced by a look of mild confusion, as if I'd just accused him of jaywalking. "No," he said slowly, his tone almost soothing, like he was trying to calm a scared child. "No, I didn't. I was just a caretaker." "You've got it all wrong." "Caretaker." I spat the word like venom, my fists clenching at my sides. Don't you dare try to explain this away." My voice cracked, and my breath hitched as rage boiled over, consuming me. The words faltered, catching in my throat, strangled by the weight of my emotions. "I'll kill you," I finally forced out, though my voice wavered, trembling with pain and fury. He stood there, calm and unfazed, like my threat was nothing more than idle chatter. "Hey, man," he said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Let's calm down. Sit down, yeah. Let's talk about this over dinner. I'm serious, come on in. It's getting cold." Then, as though I hadn't just threatened his life, he turned his back to me and walked away, his voice trailing off down the hallway. "Don't leave me to eat alone now," he called cheerfully, his tone maddeningly casual. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. My vision narrowed, tunneling until all I could see was him, this man, this monster, standing there like he hadn't just destroyed everything I thought I knew. I wanted to kill him right then and there. The rage was white-hot, searing through me, begging to take over. But years on the force had taught me restraint, how to hold back when every fiber of my being screamed to act. I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails dug into my palms, the sharp sting grounding me, holding the anger at bay. Still, the fury churned, swirling into something darker, confusion, helplessness, and a sickening curiosity I couldn't shake. I needed to know about my sister. About her disappearance 3 years ago, the silence that had swallowed her whole. Why she left without so much as a goodbye. And, most of all, what she'd been doing in those lost years. The thought of following him twisted my gut into knots, every instinct screaming for me to turn around and leave. But standing there, caught in limbo, was no better. I wasn't walking away from this, not now, not after everything. With a deep breath that did little to steady me, I forced my feet to move, stepped inside, and followed him. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of dread pressing down on me like a physical force. The air inside was thick and suffocating, the kind of atmosphere that seemed to cling to your skin and crawl into your lungs. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. And I wasn't leaving until I found the answers. The dining room was set for a large meal, a roast lamb sitting at the center of the table, its tender meat already carved into slices. Side dishes surrounded it, along with drinks and glasses half filled. But the room was oddly empty, save for the man who had invited me in. He sat at the head of the table, directly across from me, his presence commanding despite the casual setting. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "It's great that we finally get to meet, Ethan," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I've got so much to tell you." I couldn't hide my suspicion. "And who are you?" He chuckled lightly. "You'll find out." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Come, sit. Eat whatever you want. I recommend the steamed asparagus. Bonnie makes it really well." I didn't sit. I stood still, staring at him, trying to process the surreal scene unfolding in front of me. He didn't seem bothered by my silence and continued with a shrug. "Now, I just want to remind you," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious, "you came here of your own free will. You can leave whenever you want. No one's forcing you to stay. But I have to say, I really enjoy your company." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his stomach. "Before I go on, is there something on your mind? A question you need answered?" It didn't take long for the question to come. The one that had been gnawing at me ever since I stepped into this twisted game. "Why did you do it?" I asked, my voice low but steady. "Why kill all those people?" He paused as if my question disappointed him. He sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Straight to the point, huh?" he muttered. "Look at the world around you. What do you see?" "I see death. You, of all people, should know that. People die every day, all the time, hundreds every second, thousands every minute. So what's a few more lives?" just a drop in the ocean of death. He stood up suddenly, his voice rising. And when people die, everything becomes meaningless. Everything they've done, everything they've loved, worthless. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter. People can never make the right choices, Ethan. We're getting closer and closer to the end. But I've made my choice. His eyes locked onto mine, as if waiting for me to understand. I shook my head, disbelief and fury tightening my chest. What choice? I snapped. You're torturing people, killing them. How does that solve anything? His face darkened, his voice rising with fervor. Don't you see? I'm saving us all. I'm shaping the next step in humanity's evolution. Soon, they'll worship me, because I'm the only one who truly sees the path forward and has the courage to walk it. He turned, gesturing broadly, his silhouette framed by the dim light. Yes, the first deaths were regrettable. But they were necessary. Sacrifices for a greater purpose. They brought me closer to creating the perfect being, the savior of humanity. He fixed his gaze on me, his finger pointing as if casting judgment. And you, Ethan, will join me. You'll be its custodian. Together, we'll usher in this new world. I stared at him, stunned. Was this man truly so far gone? Join him? Was he delusional or just plain evil? My thoughts raced for an escape plan, but curiosity clawed its way to the surface. I had to know. Why me? I asked, my voice low but steady. Of all the people out there, why me? His smile was slow and chilling. He chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Ah, Ethan. So sharp, yet so blind. Do you really think I chose you? His tone was laced with disdain. Look at yourself. Trembling like a cornered animal. There are countless others far more suitable. His words stung, but I held his gaze. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, daring me to understand. So, why do you think I chose you? I don't know, I admitted, my voice faltering. The notes, my sister. You made it seem like you cared about me. He sneered, his face twisting with mockery. Care about you? No, Ethan. This isn't about care. It's about purpose. He paused, then asked, tell me, does your sister often take midnight strolls? The question hit me like a slap. My breath caught. Probably not, I managed, though doubt gnawed at me. Then why was she out there that night, he pressed. Until now, I'd never considered that. I had focused on how she disappeared, never questioning why. The idea that she might have gone willingly felt like a betrayal, but the man's words sowed seeds of doubt I couldn't shake. He smirked, clearly enjoying my discomfort. You deserve the truth, Ethan. Everyone does. People cling to their secrets, hoping the darkness keeps them safe. But he spread his arms wide, like a prophet, I seek transparency. A world without lies. Imagine, no deception, no judgment, only acceptance. He gestured toward me, his voice softening. Didn't I tell you exactly where this was? Twice, even. Doesn't that prove I value honesty? I frowned. You shot at us the first time, I countered. He shook his head, almost amused. I didn't shoot at you, Ethan. You just happened to be there. Now listen carefully. He stepped closer, his tone shifting to something more intimate. I'll explain everything, but first. He raised his cup, taking a deliberate sip. I need something from you. My chest tightened. What? Your loyalty, he said simply, his gaze unwavering. Tell me, Ethan. Will you join me? My stomach churned. Are you insane? I spat at his face. There's no way I'd ever join you. A slow smile crept across his face, a mix of amusement and pity. Unfortunately, he murmured. His eyes scanned me, sharp and probing as if he could see through my very soul. You've always had a knack for slipping into situations you don't belong in. I think you'd make a fine snake. Before I could process his words, a sound behind me made me whip around, too late. A heavy metal bar swung toward me, and everything went black. The last thing I registered was the sickening crack as it struck my forehead, sending me sprawling to the floor. Hurt. It was the first sensation that registered when I came to, the hot, searing pain that seemed to radiate from my forehead and rippled through my entire body. My head throbbed in time with my heartbeat, each pulse a sharp stab that blurred my vision. My ears felt like they were stuffed with cotton, muffling the world around me into a dull hum. The floor beneath me was cold metal, slick with sweat, my sweat. My arms ached, stretched unnaturally above my head, the bite of steel shackles digging into my wrists. Panic flared as I tugged against the restraints, the effort sending fresh waves of pain through my already battered body. I screamed or tried to. The sound came out as a muffled cry, my voice trapped behind something rough and unyielding. A gag. The realization made my breathing quicken, ragged gasps echoing in the confined space. I was trapped, bound and gagged, held in the clutches of a murderer. Behind me, a voice cut through the haze, calm and chillingly familiar. You know, he said, his tone almost conversational, I told you, Ethan. You can leave any time. But if you don't give me your allegiance. He paused for effect. I'll have to take other measures. I craned my neck to look over my shoulder, my movements sluggish and uncoordinated. He stepped into view, the man from dinner, now holding a tool that made my blood run cold, a saw. Its serrated teeth glinted under the harsh, flickering light. I'll make it quick, he continued, his voice unnervingly composed. But I should warn you, I'm not a fan of anesthesia. Pain is natural. The body was designed to feel it. He moved around me, circling like a predator savoring its prey. My eyes followed him, my chest rising and falling in a panicked rhythm. He stopped in front of a tripod-mounted camera. With a press of a button, the red light flickered on, signaling that it was recording. The blade of the saw hovered over my left arm, just below the crook of my elbow. Now, he said, his voice dropping to a murmur as he focused on his work, the snake has no arms. We'll start there. A surge of primal terror took over. My body reacted before my brain could process it. I thrashed against the chains, the metal biting into my skin, desperate to break free. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, igniting every nerve in a frantic attempt to survive. "Don't struggle, Ethan," he said, his tone maddeningly calm, as if he were offering advice rather than preparing to maim me. "It'll only make things worse. Just relax, it'll be over soon, I promise." The saw pressed against my skin, its teeth biting into flesh with unbearable sharpness. The sound of it, metal grinding against bone, was worse than the pain. A scream built in my throat, but the gag choked it into silence. Pain consumed me, searing through my body as my vision faded to black. Warm blood poured from the gash, slick and unrelenting. The man didn't stop. The jagged teeth of the saw bit deeper, grinding through veins and arteries with a dreadful rhythm. Back and forth. I felt it hit bone, a nauseating vibration, and then came the sickening scrape as he pressed harder, severing it completely. I passed out for the second time that night. When I woke, the gag in my mouth was gone. So was my arm. What remained was crudely wrapped in gauze and cinched tight with a tourniquet. The pain was unbearable, sharper and heavier than before, like my body was protesting its mutilation. The man was still there, standing behind a camera, an air of satisfaction on his face as he saw me stir. "Had a good rest?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. He stepped closer and grabbed my remaining hand, his grip firm, almost casual. "Everyone deserves the right to choose, don't you think? Free will is what makes us human. So, I'm giving you a choice." His voice turned cold, the weight of his words crushing. "You can walk out of here right now and work for me. Or," he paused, a twisted grin spreading across his face, "you can lose your other arm and let me stitch your legs together. Your call. Work for him, or die in his hands." Survival instinct drowned out any thought of resistance. "I'll work for you," I managed to choke out, each word a struggle as I gasped for breath. "Good. Glad we could come to an understanding," he said with mock civility. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key, unlocking the door in a few swift motions. "You can start your training now. Explore the house, leave if you want. I'm not keeping you prisoner. There's food in the fridge if you're hungry." He turned, heading for a staircase I hadn't noticed before. "Oh, and Ethan," he glanced back, his smile deepening. "You'll like this." With that, he disappeared up the stairs. I tried to sit up, but the room spun violently, forcing me back down. When I finally managed to get to my feet, it felt wrong. Lopsided, unbalanced, like the world tilted on an unfamiliar axis without my arm. The space around me came into focus, some sort of basement. Surgical equipment cluttered every surface, a grim testament to the horrors that had taken place. Cameras dotted the room, some still blinking red, their cold, unblinking gaze fixed on nothing. Ahead of me was a staircase leading upward. To my left, a single door stood out, the word elephant scrawled across it in bold letters. Curiosity outweighed fear. I opened the door. A putrid wave of musk and decay hit me immediately, thick and suffocating. The room was dimly lit, the corners swallowed in shadows. A machine hummed softly in the background, its tubes connected to something in the center of the room. The door slammed shut behind me. The pile in the middle stirred. I froze, my breath caught in my chest as the mass shifted and turned. My heart sank as realization dawned. This wasn't a pile of things. It was a person. Grotesque folds of flesh enveloped the figure, their body unnaturally large, as though they'd been trapped in a perpetual state of forced growth. Tubes ran from the humming machine into a mask covering their face, pumping a pale, viscous liquid into their mouth in slow, unrelenting intervals. I'd seen this before, once, when hunting a killer in an abandoned mental hospital. A force-feeding device. As the figure turned fully toward me, I saw more horrors. Thick metal rods inserted into its nostrils, the ends jutting out grotesquely from its skull. The skin around the rods was scarred and inflamed, a sickening reminder of the brutality they'd endured. I took a step back, bile rising in my throat as the sheer grotesqueness of the scene set in. This was no choice. It was a nightmare I couldn't escape. The man dragged himself forward, clawing at the floor, his breath shallow and ragged. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading, begging for release. But there was something else in his gaze, something that stopped me cold. Recognition. I squinted, forcing myself to see past the horror, past the grotesque shell he'd become. And then it hit me, like a punch to the gut. It was Carter. My friend. What have those inhumane bastards done to you? He was beaten, broken, and bloated beyond recognition, but it was still him. That spark, that flicker of humanity buried under the weight of everything done to him, it was there. My legs buckled as I collapsed beside him, resting my head on his massive shoulder. And I cried. I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a kid. Deep, heaving sobs tore through me as the reality of what I'd lost settled in. This was what broke me. Not the arm, not the saw, not the endless fear. Seeing Carter like this, he didn't deserve it. No one did. Through blurred eyes, I glanced back at the saw, the same one that had taken my arm. My chest tightened as I stood, the blade heavy in my good hand. I knelt in front of Carter, the saw trembling between us. His eyes glistened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a smile. A stream of tears flowed down his face. A slow, deliberate nod followed. He understood. So did I. It would take more strength than I had to saw with one hand, so I raised it high instead, letting gravity do the work. One clean swing. The blade sank deep, severing his aorta. His body shuddered once, then stilled. I let the saw drop beside him, the clang echoing through the room. I walked to the stairs and climbed, my feet dragging on each step. The front door loomed ahead, wide open, inviting me into the night. Gravel crunched beneath my bare feet as I stepped outside. Sharp stones dug into my skin, but I didn't stop. I was leaving. Nothing would stop me. But I wasn't leaving for good. I'd be back. For Carter. For Amelia. For everyone that man had destroyed. The road stretched ahead, empty and silent. As I walked, 3 thoughts filled my mind, each one louder than the last. The first thought, how would I get back? I had no idea where I was, at least a 30-minute drive from civilization, maybe more. Hitchhiking wasn't an option, there were no cars, and even if one did pass, the chances it'd take me the right way were slim. I could go back to the farm and try to hotwire something, but I wasn't ready to face that place again. Not yet. The second thought, why didn't I have shoes? The sharp edges of the gravel sliced into my feet with every step, blood mixing with dirt to leave a dark trail behind me. Eventually, I moved to the muddy shoulder of the road. It was softer and easier, but it didn't make sense. Of all the things that monster could have taken from me, why my shoes? The answer came quickly, mind games. He wanted me to feel powerless. Vulnerable. He knew the first thing I'd do after leaving would be to walk, so he made it hell. 2 options, turn back and face him, or keep going, enduring small but constant pain with every step. The third thought, I'd made a mistake. A huge mistake. I'd let him manipulate me, again. He was always 2 steps ahead, pulling the strings while I danced to his tune. Confronting him had been reckless, a stupid fantasy born out of delusions of bravery. And now, I had nothing to show for it except a missing arm and a dead friend, but maybe this wasn't the end. I couldn't undo what I'd done, but I could still make it right. This didn't have to be my story. It didn't have to end here, walking barefoot down a road with nothing but regret to keep me company. A single phone call to the police could have ended this nightmare. And maybe it still could. I had an address, a confession, and evidence. For the first time, I felt like I might have a chance to end this nightmare. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't doing it alone. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. No signal. Of course. Perfect. Grumbling, I kept walking. Another 20 minutes passed before I heard it, a low rumble in the distance. I turned and saw a car cresting the horizon, an old blue Chevy rolling toward me, kicking up a cloud of dust on the gravel road. Finally, I thought. I stuck out my thumb, though I must have looked like hell, barefoot, one-armed, and filthy. Not exactly the kind of person you'd want to pick up. Still, it was worth a shot. Maybe, just maybe, the driver was a kind farmer heading into town. The Chevy slowed and pulled up beside me. The driver rolled down the window and gave me a quick once-over. His eyes lingered on my missing arm. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he pulled over and stopped. I opened the door and climbed into the passenger seat. "Thanks," I said, my voice hoarse. The man turned to look at me, and I mean really looked at me. Short cropped hair. Scraggly beard. Eyes that seemed both far away and too sharp, like they could see right through you. My stomach dropped. I knew him. This wasn't some farmer. This was the nurse from before. Panic surged. I flung the door open and stumbled out of the car, ready to walk if it meant getting away from him. "Hey, Ethan," he called out, stepping out of the car and blocking my path. I froze, my body rigid. He waved like we were old friends. "Come on, don't be like that." I didn't say a word. He walked toward me slowly, his hand outstretched like he wanted a handshake. I stared at it until he awkwardly dropped it back to his side. "Look," he started, trying for a casual tone, "maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I'm Adrian. Nice to see you again." "Your pleasure," I shot back, my voice dripping with contempt. Adrian's face flickered with disappointment, but he didn't let it show for long. "So, you tried calling 911. My heart skipped a beat. "How do you know that?" I demanded. He shrugged, leaning back against the car like we were just chatting. "The GPS tracker in your arm. It tells us where you are and blocks your phone signal. I implanted it while you were out cold." A chill ran through me. "So, it wasn't a signal issue," I muttered. Adrian smiled faintly like he was proud of his handiwork. "Let's cut to the chase," he said. "Come back with me. You can't be trusted not to call the cops, but we'll play fair. We're not here to hurt you. You said you'd work for us. Let's keep it simple. Come back, Ethan." I clenched my fists, bracing for a fight. "And how exactly are you planning to stop me?" Adrian sighed, pulling a small key fob from his pocket. He pressed a button. Agony. It hit me like a truck, waves of sharp, unbearable pain ripping through my body. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the gravel, gasping for air. He released the button, and the pain stopped, leaving me trembling and weak. "Forgot to mention," Adrian said, casually twirling the key fob. "The tracker has a safety feature. That was level 3. It's just a warning." He tapped his temple, a mocking smirk on his lips. "Level 8. It messes with every system in your body. Level 10. Instant death." I instinctively glanced at my right arm, horrified at the thought of what was buried inside me, a tiny machine capable of tearing me apart. Adrian crouched down, tilting his head. "So, Ethan. Ready to come back?" His tone was calm, almost friendly, but I knew better. This wasn't a question. This was an order wrapped in the illusion of choice. The drive back was suffocatingly quiet. Every time Adrian tried to spark a conversation, I shot him down with curt, clipped replies. I didn't need to say much, my silence said it all. I didn't want to be here. We pulled onto the familiar gravel lane leading to the farm, the old house standing like a monument to my defeat. The man was already waiting, perched on the porch like he knew I'd be back. He knew. Of course, he knew. All that talk about choices, nothing but smoke and mirrors. Another one of his sick games. The old man stood as I climbed out of the car, a warm, almost paternal smile spreading across his weathered face. "Ethan, you're back. I'm glad to see you." His tone made my skin crawl. "Come in," he said, motioning toward the house. "We have much to discuss. The others are having breakfast. You should join us." I followed him, my feet dragging, my mind racing. We entered the dining room, and there they were. Around the long table sat about 19 people, eating bacon, eggs, and toast like it was any other morning. Except it wasn't. I recognized most of them. Sergeant Grace sat near the head of the table, buttering her toast with an ease that made me sick. She noticed me and smiled, waving like we were old friends. Beside her, Oliver was pouring milk into his glass. His eyes flicked toward me for a second before he turned away, refusing to meet my gaze. Shame, maybe. Or guilt. And then there were others, faces I'd seen in passing, in news reports or industry events. Nurses, policemen, journalists, doctors, surgeons. Even a politician or two. All of them. Eating together. Laughing. In a murderer's house. The man clapped his hands behind me, the sound sharp and commanding. "All right, everyone, please welcome Ethan," he announced with pride. "He's our newest zookeeper. But don't worry, we're still waiting for more." "Welcome, Ethan," they chimed in unison. Their voices were hollow, robotic. I scanned the room, my throat tightening. 19 people. Too many. The old man gestured for me to follow, turning on his heel without another word. I trailed behind as he led me through the house, casually pointing out the rooms as if this were some kind of twisted tour. Here's the kitchen. 2 living rooms. 3 bathrooms spread across both floors. The bedrooms are upstairs, though most of us prefer the tents outside. It's quite the community, isn't it? I didn't answer. Finally, he led me to the basement. My stomach churned as I stepped into the room. "This," he said, spreading his arms wide, "is where the magic happens." Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The large operating table dominated the center of the room, the metal surface stained with dried blood. Machines and instruments lined the walls, their sterile shine contrasting sharply with the rusty saw hanging on a nail nearby. Cameras stood on tripods, pointed at the table like silent witnesses. I frowned, taking a closer look at the cameras. "What are these for?" The old man chuckled, the sound low and almost jovial. "What do you think?" he asked. "How do you think I pay for all of this?" I turned to face him, the pieces clicking together in my mind like a sick, twisted puzzle. You sell videos of people being tortured?" His laughter echoed in the room, cold and hollow. "You're quick." "Yes, Ethan. Torture films are highly sought after in certain corners of the internet. Of course, money isn't my main motivation, but it does fund my work. Your little debut, sawing off your own arm, sold for nearly $5,000. Not bad for a first act, don't you think?" I felt bile rise in my throat. He continued, oblivious to my disgust. "And the beauty of it is, it's a cycle. I get paid to saw off a leg, and then I get paid to saw off another. It's perfect. Efficient. You've seen the results of my system." He gestured toward the door marked elephant. "That's where I keep my unfinished projects," he said with a sigh. "Sadly, it's empty now. But oh, my elephant was a masterpiece. a true work of art. Still, it's fine. We'll have a cat soon. His words hung in the air like poison, each one making it harder to breathe. The smell clawed at my senses as I stepped into the barn, and the first breath of the thick, putrid air hit me like a sledgehammer. It wasn't just rotting, it was something worse, like the scent of pain itself, raw and lingering, soaked into the very walls. My stomach churned violently, and I doubled over, gagging. When the bile finally surged, I retched onto the floor, the sound echoing in the suffocating space. I wiped my mouth with the back of my trembling hand, but it didn't stop the nausea. The taste clung to my tongue, bitter and acidic, as if the barn wouldn't let me forget where I was. My legs felt unsteady, like they could give out at any moment, and the rising panic in my chest made it harder to breathe. I forced myself to look up, my eyes scanning the room. The dim light barely illuminated the horrors around me, but it was enough. Enough to see stains, dark, crusted streaks and splatters that told a story of suffering I didn't want to understand. I glanced at the door again, desperate for a way out, my mind spiraling into a chaos of words, unfinished projects, elephant, cat, the words looped in my head, taunting me. My hands curled into fists, my nails digging into my palms. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot as if the barn itself wouldn't let me leave. I didn't want to know what came next. I couldn't know. Hearing him talk about Carter like he was just another experiment made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the casual cruelty that turned my stomach, it was the way he seemed to think he was in the right, like all of this was justified. And then he brought up my sister. The man had mentioned that on the night Amelia was arrested, she'd done something I didn't know about. The question gnawed at me, and I couldn't stop myself from asking, what was it? He paused as if weighing how much he wanted to say. How close were you to her? I shrugged, trying to sound unaffected. Pretty close. We talked once a month and spent every Christmas at each other's houses. You know, normal sibling stuff. He nodded, then asked, do you know what she was working on? Sure, I said, though the answer felt flimsy as I spoke. She was studying something. Some kind of advanced anesthetic, I think. But she didn't finish it. The man's eyes darkened, his voice low and certain. She did. I stared at him, the weight of his words settling like a stone in my chest. Before I could process it, he continued. I met Amelia on an online forum, he said, his tone shifting to something almost reverent. She fascinated me from the moment she started to talk. Her ideas, her vision, she spoke about the corruption of humanity and how she wanted to fix it. To revive it. Everything you see here, this farm, my work, it's all because of her. She was brilliant, Ethan. She was perfect. And she was mine. The possessiveness in his voice made my blood run cold. Then why did you kill her? I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. His expression crumpled, and for the first time, I saw something human in him, regret. Pain. She wanted to test the anesthetic herself, he said, his voice breaking. She insisted. I begged her not to and told her there were others we could use. But she was stubborn. She said if anyone should suffer for her work, it was her. He paused, swallowing hard. The anesthetic, it didn't work the way she intended. Instead of dulling pain, it magnified it. Every nerve, every cell in her body felt like it was being torn apart, burned alive. She was in agony, and the worst part, the side effect was immortality. She couldn't die, Ethan. No matter how much she begged me to end it, I couldn't. I felt my knees go weak as the implications sank in. So, everyone I've seen here? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded. It's easy to shape a person when they can't die. Easy to experiment, to push boundaries. Amelia wanted to be the first. She thought she could handle it, but she was wrong. The man's voice grew thick, trembling with grief. She spent years on that table, enduring things no one should endure. And yet, even in the midst of her suffering, she kept pushing forward. She came up with ideas I never would have thought of. Before I laid her body in that park, before her arrest, she gave me a final directive. He locked eyes with me, his gaze piercing. She told me to find you, to hire you, to change your vision. And now here you are, Ethan, just as she wanted. My mind spun, a storm of disbelief and fury crashing against the fragile walls of my sanity. My sister. My brilliant, kind, loving sister, someone who made hot cocoa on cold nights and stayed up late helping me with homework when we were kids, she couldn't have been part of this. She just couldn't. This bastard had to be lying. He must have twisted her arm, forced her into his grotesque schemes, and turned her brilliance into a weapon against her will. He must have. There was no way she'd do something like this willingly, no way she'd leave behind the world she loved for this nightmare. But then, the pieces started to fit together. The memory of her quiet determination, the way she talked about fixing things in the world, her obsession with her research, it all clicked into place like jagged shards of glass forming an ugly mosaic. The more I tried to tear it apart, to deny it, the tighter the truth wound itself around me, strangling my resistance. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rage, to shatter the walls around me, to grab this man by the throat and force him to admit he was lying. My nails dug into my palms, and my breaths came fast and shallow as I replayed his words, searching desperately for a crack, an inconsistency, anything to prove him wrong. But deep down, beneath the layers of anger and denial, a sinking weight began to pull at me. That quiet, horrible voice of reason whispered the truth I didn't want to hear. He wasn't lying. My knees felt weak. My chest ached as if my heart itself were breaking, cracking open under the sheer weight of this revelation. How could I have missed it? How could I have been so blind? Was it my fault for not knowing her better, for not asking the right questions, for not being there when she needed me most? I swallowed hard, trying to push the rising bile back down, but the taste of betrayal and grief lingered, bitter and unrelenting. My head bowed as the full force of it hit me. This wasn't just about her. This was about me. About the version of her I had built in my head, the perfect sister, the beacon of light in my darkest moments. That person had been shattered, and all that was left was the raw, jagged truth. and it cut deeper than I ever thought possible. He broke the silence with a clap of his hands. "Come on. There's one more thing you need to see." I followed him out of the basement, my body moving on autopilot. We stepped into the fresh air, passing a sprawling vegetable garden and rows of empty tents, their flaps fluttering in the breeze like eerie flags. Beyond the house was a barn. It was massive, painted a faded red with a steep roof and a wide, white door. Strange noises seeped from inside, groans, scraping, a low mechanical hum. The old man stopped and turned to me, his face alight with pride. "This," he said, gesturing to the barn, "is my masterpiece. My life's work. The beginning of Amelia's vision. This is where your initiation will take place. It's where you'll truly become one of us. A zookeeper." He stepped forward, pulling the heavy door open with a groan of metal hinges. "Welcome, Ethan," he said grandly, motioning for me to enter. "Welcome to the human zoo." The stench hit me like a brick wall. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, of blood and flesh long past saving. My stomach twisted violently, bile rising in my throat. I staggered forward, gagging, and threw up on the ground. As I wiped my mouth, I noticed the floor beneath me. Stains. Old, dark stains. Vomit, blood, God knows what else. I wasn't the first. The cages stretched wall to wall, each one barely large enough to contain its occupant. At first, I thought they were holding corpses, motionless, crumpled heaps that no longer resembled people. But then I heard it, shallow breaths, faint and uneven. They were alive, if this grotesque existence could be called living. Each cage bore a label: worm, dog, cat. The names twisted the knife in my gut, mocking what these people had become. The worm was a horror to behold. Its limbs had been amputated, and its body was segmented grotesquely, forcing it to drag itself forward with its head in pitiful, jerking movements. In another cage, dogs and cats crawled on all fours, their hands replaced with crude, rusted metal claws. Their movements were stiff, unnatural, like broken marionettes. Others had been stretched, twisted, or reshaped into monstrous parodies of animals. Some bore wounds so horrific I couldn't imagine how they clung to life. Yet they did, their hollow eyes staring out from filthy, tattered faces. The stench was unbearable, a choking miasma of rot, blood, and human waste. They were forced to eat rotting scraps, barely enough to keep them alive. As I walked past, a few lifted their heads, their eyes pleading with me in silent desperation. But there was no resistance, no struggle. Only resignation. This wasn't just a prison, it was hell. The old man walked ahead of me, his calm demeanor like a slap to the face. "This," he said, gesturing to the nightmare around us, "is where I house the specimens before they're released into their habitats. It's also where you'll work, feeding them, cleaning the cages, and continuing their evolution." Rage bubbled in my chest, hot and uncontrollable. My remaining hand clenched into a fist, and I felt the phantom ache where my other arm used to be. "You're treating people like animals," I shouted, my voice shaking with fury. "This is inhumane." He turned his face a mask of detached disappointment. "Look at them," he said, gesturing to the cages. "They are animals now. Their sacrifice is necessary. They're the foundation of humanity's next step. One day, they'll thank us for this." Before I could reply, he led me to the center of the warehouse, where a massive pit loomed before us. It was about 10 meters wide and 5 meters deep, with walls too steep to climb. "This," he said with sickening pride, "is where all new keepers prove themselves. Your initiation begins now." I barely had time to register his words before I felt a hard shove from behind. Off balance, with only one arm to stabilize myself, I toppled forward. I twisted midair, protecting my head as I fell. The impact hit like a sledgehammer. Pain exploded in my chest and knees as I landed on the hard ground. Gasping for air, I rolled onto my side, cradling my injured ribs with my good arm. The pit was dusty, the air thick with grime and decay. My mind swam as I tried to focus, but then I heard it, a sharp, grating sound, like metal scraping against stone. My stomach churned, and I turned toward the noise. Something moved in the shadows, its steps jerky and uneven, accompanied by a high-pitched screech with every movement. It stepped into the light, and I froze. The creature was a twisted nightmare of humans and animals. Its head sat flush against its shoulders, with no neck to speak of. Its wide, unblinking eyes stared at me, too human to ignore. Sharp steel claws extended from its fingers, and as it spread its arms, I saw patches of human skin stitched beneath. It wasn't just a creature. It was a human-turned owl. The owl lunged, its claws aimed straight at my chest. I dove to the side, but my balance was off. Pain shot through my shoulder as I hit the ground, and I wasn't fast enough to avoid the attack completely. Its claws tore through my shirt and into my skin, leaving 3 searing gashes across my chest. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the pain as I scrambled to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me. If I faltered now, I was dead. The owl's head twisted unnaturally, its empty eyes locking onto me with predatory focus. My pulse pounded in my ears as it lunged again, claws outstretched. My instinct was to dodge, but I hesitated. Running wouldn't work. Not like this. Instead, I waited until the last second, then threw myself into its path. Using my good arm, I grabbed hold of its wing, pulling with everything I had. The owl screeched, its movements frenzied as it tried to shake me off. I couldn't overpower it, not with one arm, but I could outthink it. My fingers found the stitches holding its grotesque form together. Thread by thread, I began tearing them apart. The creature thrashed wildly, its claws raking at my sides, but it couldn't reach me. My grip slipped, and I nearly lost hold, but I pressed on, ripping at the threads with desperate determination. Finally, the last stitch gave way. The owl staggered, its movements faltering as its head separated from its body. Blood poured from the open wound as the head dropped to the ground, lifeless. I collapsed beside it, gasping for air, my chest heaving with exhaustion and pain. Above me, I heard faint applause. The old man's voice cut through the haze, cold and triumphant. "Congratulations, Ethan. You've just taken your first step as a keeper. I woke up in an unfamiliar room. My chest felt heavy, each breath a reminder of the fresh wounds beneath the bandages. I pushed back the covers, revealing 3 long scars carved into my flesh. The skin was raw, the stitches neat but angry. Someone had patched me up, though not out of kindness, I was sure of that. The room was quiet, except for the faint creak of a chair. I looked up, and there he was, the old man, sitting in the corner, watching me like I was his prized specimen. His face was unreadable, his hands resting lightly on the armrests as if this was just another day at the office. "You did well," he said softly as I swung my legs over the bed. My muscles screamed in protest, but I stood anyway. My movements were slow and deliberate, and my eyes locked on him. His thin lips curled into a smirk. "Well done, boy. You're a zookeeper now." I didn't answer. I started walking toward him, my feet dragging across the wooden floor that he clasped his hands together, his voice steady and calm, like he was delivering a sermon. "You asked why I do this. It's simple, for humanity. For you, for me, for everyone. Humanity is the pinnacle of creation, and I treat it as such. With my guidance, and now, your help, we'll usher in a new era. A new evolution." I didn't stop. His smirk faltered just a little, his fingers twitching against the chair's arms. "This isn't just about you, you know. Your sister understood that. It was her vision first, and then mine. Now, it will be yours. Together, we'll lead humanity to salvation." That stopped me cold. My jaw tightened, and my heart pounded in my ears. My sister. He dared to bring her into this. He saw my hesitation and pressed on. "Out there, this philosophy has spread. There are many of us. Kill me, and you'll only continue the cycle. You'll follow in her footsteps, whether you want to or not." The words barely registered. I grabbed a ceramic vase from the bedside table. His eyes flicked to the vase, and for the first time, I saw fear in there. Real, genuine fear. He hadn't expected this. I lunged. He fumbled for something on his keychain, his hands shaking as I brought the vase crashing down on his head. It shattered, shards flying in all directions. Blood trickled down his temple as he pressed a button on the keychain. Pain. Pure, blinding pain. Electricity ripped through my body, locking my muscles in place. My teeth clenched so hard I thought they might shatter. I dropped to my knees, my vision whiting out as every nerve screamed in agony. "Level 10 will kill you instantly," he warned, his voice distorted and far away. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. My insides felt like they were boiling. Just when I thought I'd pass out, the current stopped. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. My vision returned slowly, hazy and uneven. The old man was slumped in his chair, blood pooling beneath his head, the vase still lodged in his skull. He wasn't dead, not yet. I crawled toward him, my body trembling with exhaustion and rage. With a shard of the broken vase, I slashed his throat. His eyes widened in shock, but he didn't fight back. The blood came fast, gushing out and soaking the carpet. It wasn't a satisfying death. It wasn't enough for what he'd done. But it was over. I staggered out of the room, leaning against the walls for support. In the hallway, I found Oliver pouring gasoline onto the floor. I tensed, ready for another fight. He looked up, raising his hands in surrender. "Whoa, calm down. I'm on your side. If it weren't for me, you'd still be in that pit." I stared at him, trying to decide if I believed him. Something in his eyes told me he wasn't lying. I relaxed slightly, though I didn't drop my guard. "I hate this place too," he said quietly. "I've wanted to burn it down for years. You're braver than me, though. What you did back there, that was something." "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Ending this," he replied simply, gesturing to the gas can in his hand. We worked together in silence, spreading gasoline through the house, the barn, and finally, the tents outside. The night was thick with the smell of fuel, the air heavy with unspoken anger. When we reached Adrian's car, Oliver handed me a match. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. I struck the match against the side of the car, watching the tiny flame flicker in the darkness. Then, without hesitation, I tossed it onto the ground. The fire roared to life, a hungry beast devouring everything in its path. Oliver and I drove away, the inferno lighting up the night sky behind us. 2 miles down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The horizon glowed red, smoke billowing into the heavens. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, but it was too late. Oliver broke the silence. "Where are we going now?" I kept my eyes on the road ahead, the gravel stretching out endlessly before us. The answer wasn't clear, not yet. But wherever we were going, it would be far from here.